To the point of how Israel's brutality is actually playing into Hamas's hands in terms of swelling support for their ranks and for their approach. There was a horrific report, eyewitness testimony, followed by some visual on-the-ground confirmation of execution-style shootings by IDF soldiers of women and children inside of a school. Let's go ahead and put this up. This is from a report by Al Jazeera. I'm just going to narrate here what we're seeing. These are distressing images as they are warning here. You can see the camera is going into a school. They're showing what they describe as horrific aftermath of an assault on this school. This is in northern Gaza. What you can see are, appears desks, chairs that have been burnt up, completely destroyed. You can see they're walking here into one of the classrooms where they claim bodies were piled up after eyewitnesses say they were killed execution style. This man was one of the eyewitnesses. He says, we found the bodies in the classrooms. He says there's no sign of any missiles or shells. In other words, they were execution style, just gun to the head executions. All those who were in the building were executed from point blank. The Israeli soldiers opened fire on them. He goes on to say many families came searching for their children. They found them all killed. They were all killed, executed at gunpoint. There was another woman who they spoke with as well, who had a similar story about the way that these women and children were killed. She says the Israeli soldiers came in and opened fire on them. They took all men, then entered classrooms, opened fire on a woman and all the children with her. The woman said there were newborn children among them. The Israeli soldiers executed those innocent families at point blank. So you have the combination of eyewitness testimony along with the bodies that were recovered and the evidence that they had been killed by bullets versus missiles, adding up to, a really horrific situation. It's not also the first time that there have been accusations that Israelis have murdered people execution style, murdered civilians in Gaza execution style.
Unfortunately, this is something that's a very dark period of Israeli history in terms of the Kibaya massacre involving Israeli Sharon. This is very well known amongst a lot of Palestinians. And I think it also just highlights the need for independent reporting and, UN organizations, others, just like we allowed actually during the invasion of Iraq, in order to make sure that incidents like this don't happen or they're investigated properly. The IDF actually, as far as I understand it, Krystal, has not addressed what's happened here. So obviously they need to give an explanation. And look, it's possible somebody else did, I guess. But if they're going to be responsible for it, then they need to actually come forward with some sort of explanation as to what this was. And I just think it's an independent review type scenario, desperate for what we need. One thing to highlight just for everybody to watch out for is apparently CNN was able to get a camera inside of Gaza. They're gonna air, Krystal, some of their footage later today. I'm actually very anxious to see it. It's the first Western footage that will come out of Gaza, which has not been censored by the IDF, because she went in. This is Clarissa Ward, who was there at the fall of Kabul and Afghanistan. She went in actually with an Emirati medical team, and there was no censorship. She was also on the ground in some of the areas for. Which was also on the ground in some of the areas for hospitals, et cetera. So this is exactly why we need people on the ground to be able to investigate, scenarios like this.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's ask the question then. What is all of this brutality actually gaining Israel? And how do Palestinians in Gaza, or at least how did they feel about Hamas? Because we've also had, numerous Israeli pundits, officials, American politicians claiming there are no innocent Palestinians in Gaza because they all support Hamas. Well, that is really not the case. Let's put this up on the screen. This polling is fascinating to me. So this survey was in the field right up until October 7th. It just happened that you had this Arab Barometer poll where they do in-person surveys in the field right up until October 7th. Okay, so first of all, how much trust do you have in the Hamas-led government? The top response by far among all age groups, more, overwhelming plurality of roughly 45% say none at all, no trust whatsoever in the Hamas-led government. All right, let's go to the next one. How responsive do you feel like the Hamas-led government is to what people want? Again, overwhelming plurality say not very responsive at all. So not exactly glowing reviews there. And the second highest response was not responsive at all. So not very and not at all were the two highest responses. All right, let's go ahead to the next one. What do you think is the most effective way to have a say here, to be able to influence a Hamas-led government decision? The number one answer, nothing is effective. Nothing. The second highest answer is working through personal connections. So basically corruption.
Corruption, yeah.
Okay, so that's really interesting. Very dim views of Hamas. There was a huge sense, 78% had said that the availability of food was a moderate or severe problem in Gaza. Now, you might think that perhaps that's, they would blame the Israeli government and their blockade, which certainly takes, deserves quite a bit of the blame for that state of affairs. But actually, the largest number said that they blamed the Hamas-led government for the fact that, just on a basic, like, how am I doing? How's my family doing? Am I able to get enough to eat? The Hamas took most of the blame in terms of who they were pointing a finger at. I thought this was interesting too. So Hamas, of course, they say their goal is to destroy the Israeli state. The majority of survey respondents, though, favor a two-state solution. So they're at odds even with political goals. And here what you see is, which party, if any, do you feel closest to? Fatah, which dominates the Palestinian Authority, which quote unquote runs the West Bank, or Hamas, and Hamas actually wins out. They also asked in a theoretical presidential election where you had the head of Hamas versus the head of the Palestinian Authority versus Marwan Barghouti, who's an imprisoned member of the Central Committee of Fatah. Actually, only 24% said they would vote for the Hamas leader. Barghouti received the largest share at 32%. He's, again, that imprisoned activist. And Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the PA, received 12%. So they were not too impressed with Hamas as a governing authority. But, Saagar, there are a lot of signs. At this point, you can't poll Gaza because there's an ongoing war. No one can get in there. But there are a lot of signs that support for Hamas has actually dramatically increased because of the brutality of the Israeli crackdown. And that is consistent with history. If you look at the polling, and that's one of the things that they talk about in this piece, if you look at polling over time, it's almost a one-to-one relationship. The harsher the conditions imposed by the Israelis or the more brutal attacks that are being waged, the higher the support for the more militant terrorist organizations. When there seems like there's some actual path to peace and prosperity through nonviolent means, lo and behold, support for militant groups like Hamas decreases. It doesn't take rocket scientists to figure this stuff out.
No, it's not. And we have a lot of historical precedent we can talk about here. I'll turn to Vietnam. We've been talking about it a lot here. The communists were not popular. There were a lot of people who fled the north to the south because they didn't want to live under communism. But after the sustained bombing campaigns and the corruption of the South Vietnamese government and all that became to be more evident, even though people didn't necessarily want to live under communism, you were able to basically mesh together like a communist and nationalist philosophy for why you should support the VC and the NBA against the American invader and the foreign puppet. So even though they inherently, prior to foreign intervention, actually very likely looked like they could have been defeated, it was actually American intervention itself and the strength of it made it such that it actually ballooned their ranks and made them even more popular. There was also a line in here that really struck out to me. Quote, "The Hamas-led government may be uninterested in peace, but it is empirically wrong for Israeli political leaders to accuse all Gazans of the same. In fact, most Gazans are open to a permanent and a peaceful solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, yet the views of the people who live in Gaza are often misrepresented in public discourse, even as surveys such as Arab Barometer consistently show how different these narratives are from reality." I would also say this is exactly why, from a strategic perspective, this made a lot of sense for Hamas, where you've only got 50% of the population that support you, between you and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So what do? You launch a war to not only legitimize yourself as the only fighting actor against the Israelis, but then you use the response to say we're the only ones who are standing up, and that's why you got to support me. Again, very, very similar to the way that the Viet Cong and others operated in the Vietnam War. So, and this ultimately they were the victors, so we got to study what exactly made them effective. And I think that the way that this fight now continues and how that all looks for the center of gravity of that population, who they support, what they look like as legitimate. I really see this polling as a tragedy, to just say that so many of the people who lived under their rule, And this is so obvious, as usual. Most human beings are human beings. They just want to live in peace. They want enough food to eat, and they don't want to live in a corrupt, government where they have to pay somebody so that they can send their kid to college. That sucks, no matter where you are and no matter what religion you are. So obviously, they didn't like it. Now, that doesn't mean that they're pro-Israel. Let's be clear about that. But they're pro something a little bit different. And this is another reason, too, why the Israeli strategy of propping up Hamas was very important to them, because I actually think they knew that this was real, and that one of the reasons why they want to continue those Qatari cash injections is we got to keep Hamas up there, because actually there's a whole lot of Palestinians who would accept something very different, but that would be very inconvenient for the right-wing government and coalition inside. Now, obviously, it's way past October 7th. Who the hell knows where this poll, stands right now? A lot of these people could be dead. That's another question. A lot of the moderates and all those other folks who definitely did not support Hamas from day one, they could be gone. And now what you have? More of a literate population, people who've lived through war, and we know how that looks like throughout history too.
Absolutely. And there are legitimate questions over whether Israel is intentionally targeting that potential nonviolent, more moderate leadership class, that the intellectuals, the doctors. I did a whole monologue on this earlier in the week with that poet Rafat who was assassinated. There's really no doubt that there's an investigation that was conducted by a human rights organization that found, they directly targeted specifically the apartment that he was in with his sister, killing him and other family members. He had received death threats from the Israeli government multiple times, so he was very definitely directly targeted, this poet, and there's been a massive loss of intellectuals and thought leaders within the Gaza population from this war. So I think it's a very open question whether Israel is directly, intentionally targeting them for exactly this reason. Let's go ahead and put this next piece up on the screen. This is a fascinating report from the BBC. They interviewed a number of political scientists in the West Bank. And they also have some numbers to back up what we've discussed before, which is that support for Hamas in the West Bank, we don't know in Gaza, but in the West Bank, has been skyrocketing. One political scientist described the October 7th attacks as a turning point for Palestinians, just as they were a shocking turning point for Israelis. That political scientist said, the people, especially the new generation, are backing Hamas now more than at any other moment. He told me in the previous 30 years, there were no models, no idols for the new generation. Now they see there is something different. A different story is being created. And this was really pretty extraordinary as well, because obviously Fatah and Hamas have been bitter enemies for years as well. But this political scientist theorizes that both Fatah and Hamas are well aware they're complementary to each other. And I think we'll see real integration between the two movements. This is the greatest fear of, Bibi Netanyahu and others who are like-minded. They don't want to see any sort of Palestinian unified front. It's a divide and conquer strategy, and it's also elevating the extremists. So you can say, hey, I've got no partner for peace, even as a majority of Palestinians in Gaza say we want a two-state solution, and even as he and his government are very clear about how they do not want a peaceful two-state solution. We'll get to that in just a moment. One of these political scientists goes on to say the Palestinian Authority realized targeting Hamas would not eradicate it because it's an ideological movement rooted within the Palestinian people, and Hamas is fully aware it cannot establish an independent Palestinian state without the help of Fatah. So that's why he's arguing that they realize that they need each other. But they track here how there has been a real change in viewpoint among the Palestinian population. Again, this is in the West Bank, not Gaza. Could be totally different, but I think there are probably some similarities here. And remember, in the West Bank, the brutality of what's unfolding there is nothing like, of course, what's unfolding in Gaza, but there has also been a lot of violence there. More than 200 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th in the West Bank as well, partly at the hands of the IDF, partly at the hands of these extremist settlers.
Yeah, we don't know. It's interesting, actually. Something just came across my radar, is you had a top Hamas official, actually, who just did an interview with Al Monitor, in which he suggested that the group would, quote, adhere to the PLO organization stance on Israel, aka floating Israeli recognition. You can read that two ways. One is that they're quote unquote suing for peace. I would read it very much like you are, Krystal, is that they're trying to become the legitimate successor for whatever this post movement is going to look like, both for the West Bank and for Gaza.
Yeah.
And when you read comments like that, now I would put it very much as they are recognizing their political hold here on power and what the next step for them may look like, but not only to survive, but also to become the genuine governing authority. So actually, you know, I think you can really look at that polling and some of the now increased support Hamas in the West Bank really as a tragedy to say that while the Palestinian Authority itself was corrupt, the ideas which they were built upon, which was Palestinian identity, not nonviolent resistance, I guess, per se, but at least post-Oslo, some sort of cooperation two-state scenario, that was a relative majoritarian position amongst a lot of Palestinians, but it was the extremists really who tried to overthrow it, and they may actually set it back by, I mean, who knows, not even decades. I would say, you know, maybe a century, something like that.
Extremists on the Palestinian side and extremists on the Israeli side basically teamed up, not directly, but in a manner of speaking, to derail any sort of a peace process, and it worked.
It did work.
They worked. They won, you know, and now here we are where we are today. To go back to, well, let's talk about some of those extremists. Now they run the Israeli government. This is an interview with an Israeli ambassador on Sky News, where she's being pressed over, okay, you know, you all say there's no partner for peace on the Palestinian side. Do you all want a two-state solution? Take a listen to this.
Two-state solution? Is there still a chance for a two-state solution?
I think it's about time for the world to realize the Oslo paradigm failed on the 7th of October, and we need to build a new one. And in order to build a new one...
Does that new one include the Palestinians living in a state of their own? Is that what it includes?
I think the biggest question is, what type of Palestinians are on the other side? This is what Israel realized
do they have
on
a
7th
state,
of October.
though?
The answer is absolutely no, and I'll tell you why.
Well, then how can there be peace? And how can there be peace in
the reason there is no peace
Israel
is because the Palestinians...
without offering
Marcus,
a state to Palestine, how can there be peace in Israel?
Israel knows today, and the world should know now, the reason the Oslo Accords failed is because the Palestinians never wanted to have a state next to Israel. They want to have a state from the river to the sea.
So the two-state solution is dead.
Why are you obsessed with a formula that never worked, that created this radical people in the other side? Why are you obsessed with that?
So she says to a two-state solution? Absolutely not. This is not surprising. I mean, this has been the position of Netanyahu, the Likud party, certainly his extremist coalition partners for years. These are people who've been opposed to Oslo from the beginning of Oslo for literally decades. But to have it so out there, brazenly stated, no hedging in the open, is extraordinary for a number of reasons. I mean, it blows up one of the central myths in American politics about what's unfolding in Israel, where it's all the problems are on the Palestinian side. There's no partner for peace there. Joe Biden has said his key stated objective with regard to Israel and Palestine is ultimately to get to a two-state solution. And here you have the government that you're supporting unconditionally and shipping arms to and whatever, and pretending like this is on the table, saying absolutely not. Your key foreign policy priority is 100% off the table. We have zero interest in it, and we will do whatever we can to block it.
Yeah, I would know too. It's not just the Biden administration. This has been U.S. policy basically since 1967, or since the Oslo Accords, especially, but also has always been a legitimate, at least political aim of the U.S. State Department. Even under the Trump administration, they never abandoned this, even though they might have done it in practice. So, I mean, I think it's extraordinary, Krystal, because we don't hear it in English. We hear it in Hebrew, and I don't know why it's different, but it is just different whenever you have to hit Google Translate versus when you see somebody on Sky News who's a representative of that government. But I think look, the Biden administration too has to grapple with this of, you keep saying you want X. They say they don't actually want that. So what are we doing here? What is the actual political end, and how exactly do you come to that? Part of the reason why I think they want the Israelis to wrap up their campaign. But I mean, that's not going to do anything. You could stop the military campaign tomorrow. You could even have a quote unquote ceasefire. The political end is the one that we've all been working towards supposedly for 50 years. It's like, well, now what are we going to do?
Well, the other thing is, even if you take the governments out of it, take Hamas out of it, take the Netanyahu government out of it, and look at the polling of the populations, you actually have far more support for a two-state solution among Palestinians than you do among Israelis at this point.
Right.
We talked to that pollster, Dahlia Scheindlin, earlier in the week. I really recommend people go and listen to that. She was really, really insightful in terms of Israeli public opinion. She's a writer for Haaretz. She's a political scientist and a pollster. And it's been a long time since two-state solution has been a majority position in Israeli politics. And she said, you know, it hasn't dropped off that much during this current war, but it's nowhere near a majority. I believe she said support was somewhere around 30% for a two-state solution. So you actually have more sentiment. And that, you know, that's why these politicians, well, that's why they get elected. The Netanyahu government doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? That's why they get elected, because there's some public support for the positions that they're taking. And, you know, the idea of, okay, we can just maintain the status quo forever, this was fairly popular, not just on the right, but sort of throughout Israeli politics for probably since the second Intifada, I would say, if I had to pinpoint a time. But, you know, look at people who do this research and don't take my word for it on that one. But it's been a long time since the two-state solution has really been a majority position in the Israeli public. It's certainly not now. So that's the other puncture to the fantasy that the Biden administration and every other American presidential administration has been peddling, that there's some ongoing peace process, that you've got, you know, the Israelis really invested in, oh, how can we get peace, and the Palestinians that are standing in the way. At best, it's a lot more complicated than that. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.